مساء الخير واهلا بكم الى هذه الحلقه الجديده من واشنطن اونلاين. نخصص هذه الحلقه للحديث عن معركه انتخابات التجديد النصفي التي ستحسم مصير الكونغرس الامريكي. استطلاعات الراي الاوليه تقول ان الحزب الجمهوري يمتلك حظوظا اوفر في الانتخابات، ولكن لا تزال المفاجات ممكنه ولا تزال حظوظ الحزبين متقاربه. فكيف تؤثر هذه الانتخابات على المشهد السياسي في الداخل الامريكي وفي الخارج؟ هناك الكثير من التصريحات المتعلقة بالسياسات الخارجية نسمعها من جمهوريين وديمقراطيين، تصريحات تنم عن تغير جذري محتمل في السياسات الخارجية الأمريكية بعد هذه الانتخابات. تابعونا لمعرفة المزيد في هذه الحلقة. وضيوفي هما توم روغن الكاتب والباحث السياسي في شبكة واشنطن إكزامينر الأمريكية، ينضم إلينا من واشنطن عبر سكايب. ومن واشنطن أيضا ينضم إلينا السيد راين بوهل المختص في السياسات الخارجية الأمريكية. ابقوا معنا للمتابعة. أهلا وسهلا بك ضيفي السيد راين بوهل من واشنطن. سيد راين، هل تتفق بأن التداعيات الاقتصادية للحرب في أوكرانيا، مرحلة الخروج من وباء كورونا، ستقود إلى فوز الحزب الجمهوري في الانتخابات كما تشير استطلاعات الرأي؟
That's certainly what the polling seems to suggest across the board. Very few people thought that the Democrats had a very strong chance of holding the House, which is always traditionally more difficult for the incumbent party to hold. But recent polls over the past month and a half have suggested that the Senate is also in play in a year that is supposed to be pretty good for Democrats, a pretty easy to defend map. So I would say that there is a good chance that at the very least the House goes to the Republicans, and the Senate, I would say, is now a toss-up.
هل يتفهم الناخب الأمريكي تبريرات البيت الأبيض بأن الأزمة الاقتصادية ليست حكرا على إدارة جو بايدن؟ الإدارة ليست سببا فيها، هي أزمة اقتصادية عالمية تضرب اليوم. الصين أدت إلى استقالة رئيسة وزراء بريطانيا لاستروس، تضرب دول كثيرة حول العالم. هل يتفهم الناخب الأمريكي هذه النقطة؟
I don't think that the swing voters particularly understand the complicated nature of what drives inflation, what drives gas prices. In fact, there's plenty of experts out there that can misrepresent what those how those sorts of things, those phenomenon unfold. They're very complicated. Things like inflation have a lot of drivers. It's not just supply chains. It's also the war in Ukraine. It's the way that Saudi Arabia and OPEC set their prices at their annual or their quarterly meetings. There's a lot of inputs, and any one of them can kind of nudge around these prices. And there's still some legacy issues as well. 2020 saw a price war between Saudi Arabia and Russia that brought the price of a barrel of oil briefly negative. A lot of oil companies got hurt during that time period. They're trying to make some of that money back during this time where prices are a little bit higher. And because there's so many complicated narratives, it's very hard for a politician to create a narrative that will stick for the average voter. If you've got a 20 or 30-second soundbite, it's very hard to find a single sentence or two sentences that can capture how complicated it really is for these prices to be set.
كان هناك خلافات بارزة بين إدارة الرئيس الديمقراطي جو بايدن وبين حلفاء في منطقة الشرق الأوسط ومنهم المملكة العربية السعودية بعد مسألة قطع إمدادات أوبك والتقليل من النفط المعروض في الأسواق العالمية. هناك ديمقراطيون يقولون يجب أن نغير ونعيد تقييم كل سياساتنا في الشرق الأوسط بعد هذه الانتخابات. هل من المتوقع أن نشهد تغيرات جذرية فعلا تطرأ على سياسات أمريكا في المنطقة بعد الانتخابات القادمة؟
I don't think necessarily after the election, but after the next OPEC meeting in December, if there are more cuts and it looks like it's causing more harm to the American bottom line, causing gas prices to go up, I think that's where we'll start to see Democrats threaten to do things like suspend intelligence cooperation with Saudi Arabia in Yemen or pass a fresh War Powers Act during the lame duck session. I think those threats will increase if Saudi Arabia leads another round of cuts in December, which, given the way that the global economy is slowing, it makes some sense for Saudi Arabia to do those cuts. That will probably trigger yet more tension. In terms of the Republicans take over Congress, the anti-Saudi sentiment has kind of become a bipartisan issue, but the Republicans are unlikely to jeopardize some of the deep ties that are between Riyadh and Washington in the near term, beyond things like suspending intelligence cooperation or other symbolic measures. I think that we'll continue to see tensions build between these two countries as they kind of go their own separate ways, as they diversify their strategies away from one another. But I don't think that one individual event will be the moment where it all blows up.
نسمع من الحزب الجمهوري من يتوعد بتقليل الدعم الأمريكي لأوكرانيا في الحرب الدائرة بينها وبين روسيا. هل نتوقع مثل هذا التوجه بعد الانتخابات؟
I think it's becoming more popular amongst Republicans, particularly because the Ukrainians have done so well on the battlefield. It doesn't seem as urgent to be providing them aid. If the battlefield situation reverses in Ukraine, I think that narrative would start to change within the Republican Party. But there are plenty of Republicans, and this has always been true of the Republican Party going back to the 50s, who believe that foreign aid is something of a waste of American taxpayer money, that they're sending money abroad that should be kept at home. This is an old tradition within the Republican Party. I think Kevin McCarthy is channeling that old tradition that's gaining some salience because Americans feel that a recession is coming. And if a recession is coming, they'd rather that money be kept at home. But it's also convenient because as the Ukrainians are pushing the Russians back, it's not really creating necessarily a strategic emergency for Ukraine. They're doing well with the kit that they've got, and the United States has already allocated a lot of their spending for next year. So Kevin McCarthy is likely signaling to the base that he's going to try to control the debt. He's going to try to control foreign aid, as they're always interested in doing, particularly when they're in opposition and there's a blue White House and a red Congress. They like to do this. But I don't think that it's going to necessarily result in a significant pullback of American support for Kyiv.
هناك من الناحية الأخرى صقور الحزب الجمهوري مثل ميتش ماكونل، مثل لانسي جرام، يريدون مواقف أمريكية أكثر تدخلية فيما يتعلق بالسياسات الخارجية. يريدون دعم أكبر لأوكرانيا، تدخل أمريكي أكبر في منطقة الشرق الأوسط، زيادة لعدد القوات الأمريكية في مناطق مثل شمال شرق سوريا والعراق. أي جناح هو الجناح الأقوى اليوم في الحزب الجمهوري؟ هل هو الجناح الانعزالي الذي يؤمن بسياسة أمريكا أولاً، الجناح الذي مثله بقوة الرئيس دونالد ترامب، أم الجناح التقليدي جناح الصقور التدخليين؟
Right. The American political system is a two-party system, and that's always forced a lot of factions to be under those umbrellas that aren't always comfortable with each other. But the Republican Party right now is particularly split between multiple wings. Some of them are isolationists or neo-isolationists. Trump did tend to indulge them, but then he didn't tend to follow through very well. So trying to pull out of Syria, we saw that they eventually walked away from that. Trump and Kevin McCarthy like to kind of wink at these folks and try to give them a little bit of hope that some of their policy goals are going to be achieved, but they tend to fall back at the last minute, particularly when there are strategic consequences, as we saw in Syria. So the same reason, I believe that Kevin McCarthy will continue to say things like, we won't provide all of the aid to Ukraine to, say, rebuild their civilian economy, but they won't do anything that would necessarily cause a major problem for the Ukrainian military, because at the end of the day, a U.S. strategic imperative is to keep the Russians from conquering all of Ukraine. So as long as that is the case, the dynamics of the McConnell wing that are a little bit more interventionist, a little bit less restrained, a little bit more internationalist at times, I think that they will continue to get the final upper hand, but those tensions will play out, and we will probably see some of that play out next year if there is a blue Senate and a red House. That red House is going to want to signal to the voters that they're more true to their values, and then we could start seeing the House putting more conditions on Ukrainian aid in order to try to force the Senate, the blue Senate, into concessions to embarrass them politically.
هل تكون نتيجة الانتخابات مؤشر على توجه الناخب الأمريكي حتى في انتخابات الرئاسة لعام 2024؟ هل تخبرنا إذا ما كان هناك طريق لعودة ترامب إلى الساحة السياسية وإلى البيت الأبيض، ترامب أو شخص آخر يشبه ترامب في قناعاته السياسية؟
So yes and no. Historically, when the incumbent faces a wipeout, like in 2018, where Trump lost Congress in that election, it usually presages the opposition taking over the White House and forming a united government afterwards. But Trump is a very different kind of ahistorical phenomenon. He comes around once a generation, once every couple of generations, his kind of a charismatic archetype that's trying to remake the system. As a result, when Trump is on the ballot in 2024, I think the dynamics will be upended, and it'll be depending on things like how well the economy is doing, how is inflation going, what necessarily the pandemic experience is, how things are going in Europe, and of course, Trump's own personal legacy. What's going to happen with the 1/6, the January 6th committee in the House? What's going to happen with possible criminal proceedings emanating from that? And how will Republican voters be reacting to him through the primary system? He's coming with an awful lot of baggage, a lot more baggage than any president has in modern American history. And it's a big open question about whether or not he can replicate that historical success for an opposition party in these kind of dynamics.
الغالبية اليوم في الكونغرس الأمريكي بيد الحزب الديمقراطي في مجلس الشيوخ ومجلس النواب. ماذا لو انقلبت هذه النتيجة وتمكن الحزب الجمهوري من الفوز؟ كيف ينعكس هذا على السياسات الخارجية بشكل عام وتحديدا في الشرق الأوسط؟
Some of those things won't change. Things like the anti-China push will continue. Things in the Middle East that could become a lot more complicated. It would be very tricky for the Biden administration to strike a nuclear deal with Iran with a Republican-controlled Senate who will almost immediately signal opposition to it. They'll try to call a vote on it to try to strike down that kind of agreement. It's unlikely that Congress would go so far as to actually blow up such an agreement if it was to come along, but it becomes politically a lot more difficult to get a deal with Iran. For other places like Saudi Arabia, we'll see some anti-Saudi sentiment bubble, particularly amongst more populist members of the House and the Senate, whether they're Republicans or Democrats. The populist position right now is to be anti-Saudi. So we'll continue to see that bubble. That'll create some tension with the White House. The Biden administration is keen on making sure that relationship continues as they need it to. So we'll see some of that tension bubble up. And we could also see some populist tensions somewhat target Israel, particularly after its own elections today. If a government comes out of Israel that is a far-right government that includes far-right elements, as the polls suggest is possible, we could see populist members of the House and the Senate start to seriously question U.S.-Israeli ties. And some of that questioning may actually start to bubble over to the Republican Party for the very first time, in part because the Republicans this round are more likely to be populist, they're more likely to be isolationist, and they'll be looking for foreign ties to question, including Israel.
نعم، شكرا جزيلا لك ضيفي السيد راين بوهل، كنت معنا من واشنطن. وأتحول الآن إلى ضيفي الثاني لهذه الحلقة وهو السيد توم جوش، كبير المحللين السياسيين في شبكة واشنطن إكزامينر الأمريكية. أهلا وسهلا بك سيد توم. سيد توم، هل يهتم الناخب الأمريكي بالسياسات الخارجية؟ هل تحدد قراره تحدد لمن سيصوت في انتخابات التجديد النصفي القادمة؟
I think the two main foreign policy issues of interest to most voters are the war in Ukraine, in terms of whether the United States should continue to provide the level of aid that it has provided, both financial and military aid to Ukraine, now reaching into tens of billions of dollars. Republicans have suggested they would be perhaps more skeptical of aid were they to win control of Congress. And then the second issue is China, where especially for the Republican Party and conservative-leaning voters, efforts to constrain and deter China in terms of things such as its economic espionage, military activities around Taiwan, are a foreign policy priority. So those are the two standout issues, although, of course, there are others, such as Iran's nuclear program, North Korea's nuclear program, that also figure into the calculation for some voters.
إدارة جو بايدن التي اهتمت منذ اللحظة الأولى لفوز بايدن بالانتخابات بعقد اتفاق جديد مع إيران تقول الآن أنها لم تعد مهتمة بأي نوع من أنواع التفاهمات أو الاتفاقيات مع إيران بعد دور المسيرات الإيرانية في أوكرانيا، وبعد أيضا ما يحدث من احتجاجات شعبية وقمع حكومي لها داخل العاصمة طهران ومدن إيرانية أخرى. هل هذه مواقف مؤقتة نسمعها فقط من الإدارة قبل الانتخابات أم أنها سياسة جديدة ستستمر؟
Well, I think it's likely that some kind of talks will continue after the midterms, if only for the reason that the Biden administration has shown until now a very open-minded willingness to maintain negotiations even as progress has not been made. And you've seen people like Secretary of State Antony Blinken really for a year and a half now say time is running out for Iran to make a deal, and yet the talks really haven't been suspended, at least until recently. So I think there is still that desire in the Biden administration to try and cut a nuclear accord, a renewed deal. if they can do that. And I suspect once the midterm elections are gone and the political difficulty of justifying that perpetual negotiating stance is reduced, that they will return to the negotiating format.
هل يستفيد الحزب الجمهوري اليوم من الضائقة الاقتصادية العالمية ويحوز على عدد أكبر من المقاعد في مجلسي النواب والشيوخ وربما أيضا في انتخابات 2024 إذا لم يتعافى الاقتصاد الأمريكي ومعه الاقتصاد العالمي؟
Yeah, so I think Republicans have benefited from the difficulty that the economy is facing in terms of high inflation, lethargic growth in some areas, but really they've also benefited from taking on a much more robust stance towards issues like crime and education, trying to push back what they would see as more left-wing motivated efforts to defund police forces and to promote so-called social justice narratives in terms of education, schools. The latest polls, I think, suggest partly because of the inflation issue not going away for the Biden administration, that come the midterms, come the vote next week, that the Republicans have a greater chance of taking the Senate as well as holding on to, as well as taking the House, which has been an issue that they have, a place where they have looked stronger in recent months.
مسألة المحكمة الدستورية العليا وما لها من تبعات بعد أن عين الرئيس دونالد ترامب عدد من قضاتها كانت يعني نقطة تشغل بال الكثير من الأمريكيين وتخيفهم، وأدت إلى قرارات مثلا ضد الإجهاض، يخشى من أن تؤدي إلى قرارات ضد حقوق المثليين وملفات أخرى تهم الناخب الديمقراطي تحديدا. هل لا يزال هناك اهتمام بهذه المسألة؟ هل تحرك الملفات المتعلقة بالمحكمة الدستورية العليا الناخب الأمريكي وقراره؟
The polling suggests that the Supreme Court concerns are a much bigger issue for Democratic-leaning voters than for Republicans and independents. And for independent voters, really, who would be the ones to swing the election, either for the Democrats or the Republicans, those who haven't made up their mind, issues like crime and the economy tend to rate far higher on the priority list when pollsters ask that question, what do you care most about this election, than the Supreme Court. So as much as it is an issue that helps to galvanize Democratic voters, it's not clear that it will be an issue that could potentially swing the election in Democrats' favor, because again, crime, economy, other issues tend to take precedence for those independent voters.
عدد من الخبراء والمحللين الاقتصاديين جو بايدن نفسه يقول أنه غير مسؤول عن الأزمة الاقتصادية، هي أزمة عالمية وليست فقط مرتبطة بالحزب الديمقراطي. هل يمتلك الجمهوريون خطط فعلية لحل هذه المشكلة الاقتصادية التي يعاني منها الاقتصاد الأمريكي اليوم لو فازوا في الانتخابات؟
Well, they have outlined some, Republicans have outlined some economic plans, but they're somewhat lacking in detail at the moment. I think the real focus has been trying to present a message to voters that what's happening at the moment with Democrats is not working for a lot of people, as Republicans would put it. And so you need to vote us Republicans in, to give you a better chance. I mean, one of the areas that Republicans have talked about is reducing spending levels, which perhaps would reduce the level of money flowing in the economy as a way to bring down inflation. But in specifics, they have been lacking. I think they've just been playing off the fact that people are not happy with the situation now. People know Democrats are in power now, and so Republicans hope that will make voters decide to go a different way come the voting day.
شكرا جزيلا لك ضيفي توم جوش، كنت معنا من واشنطن عبر سكايب. وختاما شكرا لكل متابعي واشنطن أونلاين ونورث بريس، ألقاكم في حلقة جديدة الأسبوع المقبل، إلى اللقاء.